She went from trembling on a stage to shooting a Mafia enforcer. Serafina was so terrified of making a mistake that she used to flinch at shadows. But when a bleeding Mafia boss told her to hide during a massive warehouse raid, she refused. When an assassin lunged for her mother, Serafina stepped right into the line of fire. She looked the killer in the eyes, whispered, "You were wrong about me," and pulled the trigger. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was becoming the queen of the underworld.
Let us open this clinical file together, you and I. Step inside the sensory overload of this squalid club, where the stench of stale liquor masks the scent of human desperation. In the corner sits Roman. Notice his profound absence of movement. In behavioral analysis, we call this the stillness of an apex predator. He is utterly disengaged from the chaotic stimulus around him until Serafina enters his visual field. Beneath her heavy makeup, her physiological terror is glaringly obvious. Her chest rises and falls in the rapid rhythm of a prey animal with nowhere to run. It serves as a stark reminder for all of us that the most profound shifts in human psychology often occur in our darkest moments, right when our defenses are utterly stripped away. Observe the involuntary tremors in her hands under that harsh lye amber. Her movements are not seduction, but rather an extreme trauma response. It is a hollow pantomime, driven entirely by a primal need to survive the immediate threat of the intoxicated men surrounding her. From his vantage point, Roman meticulously catalogues her psychological torment. To a man of his violent pathology, she is not a dancer. She is a captive subject, paralyzed by systemic abuse. He identifies the precise tension of a victim holding her breath in a hostile environment. This illustrates a devastating truth about the human mind. When faced with inescapable trauma, the most innocent people will mentally detach and wear whatever mask is necessary, just to survive another day. Roman tracks her every movement with the cold, calculating gaze of a sociopath, assessing an asset. He reads her somatic cues, noting how her center of gravity subconsciously leans toward the distant exit. Suddenly, a patron breaks the threshold, violently seizing her wrist. Watch Roman closely here. The shift is microscopic but absolute. His relaxed posture transforms instantly into the lethal readiness of a man accustomed to inflicting grievous harm. As Serafina attempts to recoil, her expression shatters into sheer, paralyzing horror. Roman recognizes the invisible psychological chains choking the life out of her. It is a sobering psychological reality that the heaviest burdens we carry are rarely physical constraints, but rather the paralyzing grip of raw fear. Roman rises from the booth with alarming physiological control. There is no emotional dysregulation, only the chilling, deliberate pacing of a man fully comfortable with fatal violence. The ambient tension in the room spikes instantly as the surrounding crowd subconsciously registers a dominant threat. He approaches the stage, exhibiting a devastating calm, the byproduct of a deeply desensitized nervous system. Without raising his vocal register, he orders the intoxicated patron to release her. Driven by a fragile, alcohol-fueled ego, the man refuses. Roman does not escalate his volume. Instead, he applies precise, agonizing pressure to a specific nerve cluster, forcing the man to his knees. It clearly demonstrates that genuine authority never has to shout to force the world into compliance. Serafina recoils into the glaring lights, hyperventilating as her fight-or-flight response peaks. Her dilated pupils fixate on Roman, signaling a horrific cognitive dissonance. Her mind recognizes that her savior might simply be a far deadlier predator. Then Vincent, the club owner, injects himself into the dynamic. He exhibits classic sycophantic behavior, attempting to de-escalate the situation with free liquor. Roman utterly dismisses him. His focused gaze remains locked on the trembling girl. Beneath her artificial glamour, he isolates a deeply fractured psyche, systematically broken down by chronic abuse. This highlights a tragic human defense mechanism. Those carrying the deepest psychological wounds frequently construct the brightest facades just to mask their agonizing despair. You and I are about to witness the clinical devaluation of a human life. Roman shifts his glacial focus to Vincent, projecting lethal intimidation, and calmly demands her price. Vincent exhibits immediate physiological distress. You can observe the cognitive conflict behind his sweating brow, torn between pathological greed and an acute terror of the killer before him. Ultimately, his avarice overrides his survival instinct, and he names an exorbitant figure. Roman casually extracts thick bundles of currency, paying double solely, to assert absolute psychological dominance. Let us examine this closely. The most profound societal evils do not happen in the shadows. They occur in plain view, facilitated by cowards who will gladly ignore human suffering the moment it becomes financially profitable. Vincent issues a degrading command, reducing the girl to a purchased commodity. Serafina freezes, exhibiting a classic tonic immobility response. When she finally vocalizes a panicked refusal, Vincent suffers a narcissistic injury. Humiliated before a lethal alpha, his fake persona shatters into malicious rage. The girl clings to the metal stage pole, knuckles white, desperately insisting upon her own humanity. Roman observes her severe emotional dysregulation without a single flicker of empathy. He coldly categorizes her as a fully isolated captive within a brutal system. This illustrates a profound reality. Bravery is rarely cinematic. Often, genuine courage is just a terrified whisper, desperately clinging to the barest shred of dignity when the world treats you like property. Roman steps forward, using his sheer physical presence to overshadow her fragile state. With calculated, monotonous speech, he dissects the grim reality of her survival if she remains there. Briefly, her trauma manifests as acute anger. She challenges him, demanding what new variety of exploitation he represents. Before he can deploy any manipulative reassurance, two violent enforcers materialize near the exit. The psychological devastation on her face is absolute. Her brief surge of autonomy collapses entirely into learned helplessness as the physical threat registers. This dynamic teaches us a bitter life lesson. True despair takes hold the exact moment we finally recognize that our familiar sanctuaries have quietly transformed into inescapable, terrifying cages. The oppressive atmosphere of systemic violence permeates the room. She descends from the platform, exhibiting severe psychomotor retardation, moving with the sluggish compliance of a broken subject. At close proximity, Roman clinically notes the acute bruising on her wrist. He extracts her name using a deceptively gentle tone. When she whispers Serafina, he files the data away. This is the precise genesis of a trauma bond, the dark foundation where the apparent savior is merely a different breed of predator. Vincent attempts a feeble negotiation, but Roman neutralizes him with a vacant, sociopathic stare. The psychological lesson here is paramount. When trapped in a highly toxic environment, hesitating to walk out the door is nothing more than a tragic, silent form of absolute surrender. Let us examine this clinical presentation together. Serafina casts an erratic glance toward the back rooms. Her autonomic nervous system is severely overwhelmed, trapped in a cycle of hypervigilance. Roman observes her rapid ocular movements and inquires about her personal effects. She confesses a total lack of financial resources, a defining hallmark of chronic financial abuse. As the enforcers step closer to assert dominance, any flicker of optimism in her is instantly extinguished by years of dark behavioral conditioning. When Roman instructs her to move, she actively scans his face for the overt malice she expects. This perfectly illustrates how severe, prolonged trauma rewires the human brain, actively teaching the victim to fear an open door far more than a familiar, miserable cage. Observe Roman's profound affective flattening. He projects an aura of extreme lethal capacity, devoid of the base impulses driving the surrounding men. This lack of predictable predatory behavior leaves Serafina deeply disoriented. He states with absolute certainty that the hostile enforcers will not intercept them, subduing the manager with a single, dominant micro-expression. Yet, amidst this tension, Serafina drops to the floor to retrieve a few crumpled dollar bills. She hoards the dirty currency with desperate intensity, her chin elevated to mask her severe emotional dysregulation. This compulsive action reveals a deeply rooted survival instinct. When our reality rapidly destabilizes, we will fiercely cling to any tiny scrap of control just to maintain a fragile psychological baseline. Let us examine this initial behavioral baseline together. Serafina desperately clings to her last shred of autonomy, attempting to refuse the terms of her own purchase. But Roman, exhibiting the textbook traits of a megalomaniac narcissist, smoothly flips the psychological script. He tosses down more cash, claiming he only bought her time, not her soul. This is brilliant manipulation. He positions himself as the noble savior while keeping the invisible chains firmly in his grasp. The absolute silence reinforces his dominance as he turns and walks away. Serafina is frozen for 3 agonizing seconds before stepping into his shadow. We must remember a simple truth. The clinically broken often merely trade one terrifying cage for another. Observe how the environmental atmosphere violently shifts. This is not a simple exit, but a highly organized tactical extraction. Roman's guards form an imposing wall, a physical manifestation of his raw authority. Under the fractured neon lights, Serafina practically runs, her trembling hands betraying a profound panic response. Roman orders her to stay close, offering a fragile illusion of safety in a cramped hallway thick with cheap perfume and desperate choices. The other subjects watch her go. Some exhibit obvious envy, while others fight back tears, recognizing the tragic exchange of one prison for another. Life teaches us a harsh truth. Sometimes fleeing a threat simply means walking into a much darker room. Roman absorbs every glance, his calculating eyes missing absolutely nothing. We have documented this behavioral pattern countless times. The inferior male desperately bargaining with an apex predator. Vincent steps into the light, nervously labeling Serafina a liability. Roman does not elevate his vocal tone. He simply tilts his head, returning the threat with a quiet promise of absolute violence, causing Vincent to regress into the shadows. As Roman and Serafina step into the freezing alley, the sudden silence acts as a sensory shock. Serafina freezes, her body completely hijacked by terror. Her stalkers anticipated her exact escape route. 2 figures emerge from the darkness, exhibiting the patience of opportunistic hunters. To them, she is merely property. The cruelest psychological lesson is simple. Abusers always expect their victims to remain broken and paralyzed by fear. Notice the spatial dynamics as Roman smoothly positions himself between the trembling subject and the hostile enforcers. He does not shout or display typical primate aggression. He simply plants his feet, exuding complete clinical control. When challenged, Roman's megalomaniac narcissism is fully exposed. With terrifying calm, he declares that every soul in this city belongs to him. Watch the enforcer's arrogant posture instantly dissolve into a primal fear response upon recognition. Roman then analyzes Serafina, observing the crushing weight of complex trauma pulling her down. He asks for the exact numerical value of her debt, coldly reducing her ongoing nightmare into a mere financial transaction. Life teaches us a sobering reality. The most dangerous sociopaths do not roar. They simply whisper in the dark. Let us dissect this behavioral sequence piece by piece. You and I, Roman, presses the enforcers to detail the exact consequences of her default. The thug delivers a thinly veiled threat regarding a secondary target. Observe her immediate physiological reaction. The sudden, sharp catch in Serafina's throat. Roman registers this micro-expression instantly. He has identified her core psychological lever, her mother. All of Serafina's defensive coping mechanisms shatter completely. She is not fighting for her own survival. She is enduring severe trauma to shield someone helpless. It is a profoundly tragic aspect of human psychology. We will willingly subject ourselves to absolute destruction to protect our loved ones. Roman neutralizes the threat with a soft voice, cementing his dominance over the environment. Roman raises a steady hand, commanding his armed guard to stand down. He clearly extracts narcissistic supply from the tense theater of this confrontation. "Who do you work for?" he demands. His precise voice cutting through the damp air. The enforcer's facade fractures, claiming his employer will not tolerate being interrupted. Roman takes one measured step forward, physically dominating the spatial field. Then tell him he is already interrupted. The environment falls clinically silent. Behind him, Serafina exhibits visible tremors, locked in a state of severe chronic stress. She has endured deep physical torment to hide her reality from her mother, surviving purely on adrenal exhaustion. The psychiatric lesson is unyielding. Prolonged systemic exhaustion will eventually break any human mind. A dangerous psychological variable washes over her pale features. That variable is hope. Clinical experience teaches us a bitter reality. Hope often shatters a victim when it arrives before the active trauma has ceased. Roman pivots his focus to her, asking if these are the men threatening her. She freezes, her severe trauma response temporarily paralyzing her vocal cords, before whispering the name Victor Cade. Victor acts as a parasitic pathogen, feeding on vulnerable subjects through manufactured debts. Roman operates on a compartmentalized moral code, despising this crude methodology. How much? Roman demands clinically. Serafina clutches her worn purse like a physical barrier. "I do not know anymore," she confesses. "Every time I pay, they change the parameters just to break my sanity." Observe the dominant posturing Roman exhibits here. He projects the aura of a deity in an environment where fear is the primary currency. Serafina is drowning under the generational trauma of her father's failures. Roman steps closer to the enforcers, his regulated body language effortlessly claiming her as his property. When a hostile subject reaches for a firearm, Roman does not draw a weapon. Instead, he drops his vocal register to a hollow frequency. It is a calculated psychological tactic designed to induce paralysis. He promises to terminate them without a single fluctuation of emotion, forcing the enforcer into total submission. Stick with me, because this exact moment of calculated rescue is the precise incubator where the quiet poison of Stockholm Syndrome begins its cognitive spread. The hostiles retreat, leaving Serafina exposed. The millisecond the immediate threat vanishes, her sympathetic nervous system crashes, and her knees buckle. Roman reaches out to stabilize her, and her entire physical form violently recoils. This is a classic reflex of a victim conditioned to associate human contact with trauma. When he releases her and offers a verbal guarantee of safety, her fractured psyche voices its reality. She whispers that he bought her. Roman smoothly reframes the cognitive narrative, stating he merely paid to open a locked door. We all crave security, but the clinical reality is that severe abusers frequently adopt the mask of a savior. She desperately seeks the safety of his shadow, unaware she is cultivating the ideal conditions for a megalomaniac's obsession. This interaction provides a clinical blueprint of psychological entrapment. Serafina's vocal tremors escalate as she verbalizes the threat to her mother. Roman exhibits zero effective empathy. Instead, he dictates that the entire syndicate now answers to him. This is the grandiosity of a megalomaniac who perceives lethal men as mere insects. We observe Serafina processing this data as he walks to his vehicle. Is she merely exchanging a degrading prison for a sanitized one? The psychological tragedy of survival mode dictates that the brain rarely processes long-term freedom. It simply latches onto the nearest mechanism, guaranteeing another day of respiration. Devoid of alternatives, she follows him into the night, systematically surrendering the final remnants of her autonomy. Before entering the vehicle, Serafina scans the hostile environment she is abandoning. The door seals shut, instantly plunging her into a state of sensory isolation. She exhibits acute hyperarousal, her knuckles turning white as she grips her bag as a self-soothing mechanism. She is cognitively bracing for his demands. However, Roman executes a masterclass in psychological conditioning. He does absolutely nothing. The deliberate withholding of instruction creates a crushing silence. He remains in the shadows, clinically analyzing her physical tremors. The psychological lesson is undeniable. True control never requires loud declarations. By intentionally depriving her of rules, he leaves her entirely unmoored, observing her strictly as a captive specimen adjusting to a new enclosure. Let us evaluate this final assessment together. The streetlights illuminate Serafina as Roman conducts a complete visual diagnosis. He catalogs the deep wrist contusions and the physical neglect indicating prolonged chronic stress. His focus zeroes in on her primary anchor, the crumpled bag of currency. When he interrogates her regarding the funds, her shoulders instantly elevate in a defensive startle response. She confesses to holding $1,200 against an impossible deficit of $25,000 by dawn. Roman processes these metrics with the calculation of an apex sociopath. He recognizes the true purpose of this burden. The grim reality is that such manufactured debts are designed purely as instruments of psychological subjugation, engineered to break a subject's will. Let us open this clinical file together and observe how the realization entirely consumes her. When Roman inquires about the penalty for her failure to pay, Serafina verbalizes her core vulnerability, her mother. A pathological darkness shifts across his features. Conditioned by trauma, she instantly internalizes the blame, projecting her own guilt onto his silence. But a megalomaniac narcissist does not recognize human law. He flatly informs her that half the police badges in his city belong exclusively to him. His city. That possessive marker is a classic symptom of supreme grandiosity. We see the cognitive dissonance fracturing her exhausted psyche. She was not rescued by a benevolent savior. She was merely claimed by an apex predator, trading one violent reality for another. Observe the pathological dynamics forming in the confined vehicle. Streetlights illuminate the acute panic responses in her facial muscles as she demands his identity. Roman remains in the dark, displaying the cold calculation of a diagnosed sociopath. With a single directive, he orders his men to secure her mother's clinic. Psychologically speaking, this is a masterstroke of forced dependency. That one sentence shatters her hypervigilant defense mechanisms. She fights the urge to weep, yet he clinically catalogs every tremor of her breaking spirit. It is a predictable vulnerability. The psychological barriers trauma victims construct consistently collapse the moment an abuser manufactures a false sense of absolute safety. The megalomaniac leans forward, the leather seating creaking under his physical dominance. He plainly tells her that it is acceptable to be terrified. By validating her fear response, he artificially engineers trust, constructing the foundational architecture for Stockholm Syndrome. His vocal cadence is devoid of empathy, yet it strikes a chord in her fractured mind. Across the city, a rival silently loads a firearm, aware of the psychological asset Roman has acquired. Serafina is a catalyst in a pathological feud between rival antisocial personalities. Roman assumes he has simply obtained another possession. The most dangerous subjects in my case files often initiate their own destruction through a single, unchecked act of supreme grandiosity. The heavy gates retract, mirroring the consumption phase of predatory behavior. Serafina exhibits a classic freeze response, her motor functions paralyzed by terror. As the vehicle advances, her amygdala cycles through catastrophic outcomes. Past trauma has taught her a core psychiatric truth: immense wealth simply funds more elaborate sadism. Organized sociopaths like Roman do not scream. They dismantle victims using perfectly polite tones. Watching his armed personnel bow in total submission triggers a severe cortisol spike. She is entering an inescapable, highly monitored environment. The most effective psychological prisons are specifically engineered to obliterate a subject's free will without ever leaving a single physical bruise. Observe her defensive posturing here. She clutches her bag against her chest, eyes tracking every shadow in a state of hyperarousal. Her nervous system recognizes she has exchanged a disorganized threat for a highly structured trap. Roman exits the vehicle, but refrains from physical contact. He simply declares that she is safe. To a chronically traumatized subject, such declarations register as calculated deceptions. The architecture of his residence manifests his internal pathology: cold stone, heavy glass, devoid of warmth. He moves with the regulated control of an apex predator. In my professional experience, the most lethal clinical subjects do not announce themselves with overt violence. They simply open a heavy door and quietly invite you inside to be systematically dismantled. The visual contrast is clinically significant. Serafina stands in soiled clothing against sterile marble. The staff operates with trauma-induced silence. A housekeeper registers a micro-expression of shock, which Roman detects instantly. He orders the top-floor suite prepared, executing a classic protocol of physical isolation. Serafina relies on her established trauma schemas, emitting a fractured laugh and accusing him of purchasing her for exploitation. This insults his megalomaniac grandiosity. He does not classify himself as a crude buyer of flesh. He perceives himself as a messianic figure, the sole architect of her existence. This marks the genesis of a severe trauma bond. The perceived savior is systematically making himself her only source of psychological oxygen. He encroaches on her physical space, reframing a hostile abduction into a narrative of heroic intervention. Serafina retreats, respiration shallow, assessing that he represents a superior threat level. Roman exhibits no defensive denial. High-functioning sociopaths weaponize their reputation for psychological subjugation. He asserts that if physical harm were his objective, he would not bother with dialogue. This manipulation coerces the victim to misinterpret the absence of violence as profound mercy. When a staff member offers a robe, Serafina's fight-or-flight response triggers violently, stating she will not be forced into his bed. The restraint demonstrated by a clinical predator is never an act of grace. It is a psychological loan requiring massive future repayment from the victim. Using an affectless tone, he informs her she will not share his quarters. When pressed for his motive, he deploys his primary instrument of control: absolute informational dominance. He reveals her stalker will destroy her residence tonight. Pathological narcissists do not tolerate uncontrolled variables. This manufactured threat destabilizes her cognitive baseline, paralyzing her with biological terror for her mother. Roman then severs her final external attachment, stating his armed assets have already secured the medical clinic. By holding her primary emotional anchor hostage under the guise of protection, he assumes total jurisdiction over her psychological state. Captives routinely accept absolute subjugation when their confinement is brilliantly packaged as a protective shield. Her defensive mechanisms disintegrate. She weakly argues he lacks real knowledge of her identity. Roman maintains unbroken eye contact, asserting he knows enough. For a subject enduring lifelong emotional neglect, being intensely perceived by a dangerous figure acts as a potent neurological narcotic, overriding rational threat assessment. She is escorted upstairs. Exhaustion battling nervous system arousal. Let us evaluate this file together, you and I. This is the precise juncture where Stockholm Syndrome takes root. She enters the isolated suite, the heavy door securing her inside. The environment is engineered to render her previous existence obsolete. Total captivity of the mind is established the exact second a patient completely ceases to search for an escape route. The suite is a sensory overload chamber, outclassing her socioeconomic reality to induce profound dependence. The attendant provides garments and nourishment. Due to chronic trauma, Serafina's brain cannot process generosity without calculating the impending abuse. She questions their motive. The employee administers a dose of validation, stating the master never brings females here. Complicit staff routinely reinforce the delusion that the captive possesses unique value. The attendant exits, the lock engaging with finality. Stripped of chaotic external stimuli, Serafina is subjected to absolute acoustic deprivation. In my clinical observation, catastrophic psychological decompensations consistently occur in perfectly silent rooms where the patient can no longer hide from their own mind. In isolation, she regresses to a self-soothing ritual, inventorying her currency. $1,140. In organized crime, this capital is irrelevant. It cannot protect her mother. As realization overrides denial, her nervous system experiences a catastrophic failure. Motor tremors cause her to drop the cash onto the sterile floor. She collapses, emitting a raw vocalization of psychological agony. Exhibiting distress within a sociopath's territory is the biological equivalent of bleeding near an apex predator. A sharp knock strikes the heavy door. Her survival instincts instantly re-engage, forcing her to rapidly suppress the visible symptoms of her collapse. Chronic victims always learn to conceal their internal fractures just to delay their own destruction. The cart contains basic nourishment: warm soup, bread, and tea. This absence of luxury is a calculated variable. In coercive control cases, sudden comfort from an abuser is far more destructive than blunt force. Physical violence is a vector the ego can defend against. Weaponized, kindness bypasses rational thought, fundamentally remapping a patient's deepest loyalties. A handwritten directive instructs her to eat and rest. Her trauma screams for avoidance, but biological starvation forces compliance. Consuming the broth triggers a dopamine release, germinating the toxic pathology of gratitude toward her captor. 2 floors below, the megalomaniac resumes his executive functions, calmly reviewing his files. The psychological architecture of her containment is now fully operational. Dominic crosses the shadowed study, reporting that Serafina's mother is guarded, while Victor's men dismantle the city searching for the girl. Roman listens, eyes narrowing. He murmurs that money is irrelevant here. From a clinical standpoint, the mechanics are obvious. A minor debt is merely a fabricated leash. Victor, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist, does not want cash. He requires absolute terror and compliance, knowing she links to a greater prize. Roman is not sheltering her out of benevolence. He is securing an asset. Let us evaluate this carefully together. We are watching 2 apex sociopaths play a psychological chess match. The lesson is grim. In any territorial war driven by malevolent ego, the deepest wounds are always inflicted on the innocent pieces. Dominic observes the measured rhythm of Roman's breathing. For years, he has watched this man dissect territories with absolute emotional detachment. Yet Serafina is a glaring disruption to his cognitive baseline. "Are you planning to keep her here?" Dominic asks. Roman physically freezes, attempting to classify her as mere collateral. "She is not a tool," Roman snaps, raw emotion tearing from his throat. I clearly see his pathological armor fracturing. It illustrates a fundamental psychological truth. Sudden human attachment is the single chaotic variable that cold logic can never suppress. Recognizing the escalating volatility, Dominic quickly shifts tactics. "I pulled what I could on Victor," he states, laying out the megalomaniac's sprawling network. Victor specifically targeted isolated women. As Dominic speaks, Roman's facial muscles lock into stone. And nobody told me, he demands, a tremor betraying his control. His rage does not stem from empathy. It is the narcissistic injury of an apex predator discovering another hunter inside his domain. His cognitive illusion of absolute supremacy is dissolving entirely. Dominic hesitates before presenting a folder of his father's old ledgers. Roman scans the brittle paper, his respiratory rate shifting as he processes an inescapable history. We see a clinical absolute here. No individual can permanently sever the psychological conditioning of their bloodline. Suddenly, his pupils dilate at a single entry. Marrow, Serafina's father. Beside an emergency cash advance rests a heavy, familiar crest. It was his father's insignia. Dominic tracks a twitch of violence in Roman's jaw. It means her father borrowed from my father, Roman states, using a flat tone to suppress his rage. Or someone engineered it to look that way, Dominic counters. Well, for a subject demanding absolute authority, this covert manipulation is agonizing. Upstairs, Serafina stands under scalding water, engaging in a cleansing ritual to scrub the club's trauma from her skin. But heat cannot wash away psychological wounds. Staring into the glass, her dissociative armor dissolves. This illustrates a universal constant. Severe exhaustion inevitably strips away our defensive personas, exposing the fragile core beneath. She is a terrified daughter gripping the cold porcelain sink. Then, a sharp knock strikes the wood. Her nervous system misfires, adrenaline flooding her veins. "Who is it?" she calls out. Roman comes the low reply. She opens the door a fraction, utilizing the barrier as a psychological shield. He stands in the corridor, predatory markers undeniable. "Your mother is safe for now," he states. Serafina exhales a fractured breath. For now, she whispers, her amygdala identifying the threat. He warns that Victor will strike again. Her cognition instantly reverts to its traumatized baseline. "Then I have to go back to the club," she concludes. Notice the trauma response. Victims routinely sprint back into a familiar cage to avoid the paralyzing anxiety of an unpredictable future. Roman stares, clearly destabilized. "You think I brought you here to send you back?" "You cannot protect me forever," she replies weakly. "I do not need forever, I need tonight." His posture radiates the arrogance of a god complex, believing his shadow alone can hold back the dark. "You do not understand," she begs. "If I do not pay, they do not stop." Roman invades her proximity, suffocating the space. Then maybe it is time he met a man who does more than scare him. Serafina freezes, torn between flight instincts and the pull of a violent savior. His gaze drifts to the crumpled currency on the bed. "You are counting again," he observes softly. Shame triggers her defensive hostility. "It is none of your business." "It became my business when they threatened your mother," he counters. "Why?" she snaps. Clinically, anger is simply a fragile shield a subject raises when they lack the neurological stamina to process any more fear. The tension is suffocating. "Why do you care?" she demands. "Because you wanted to feel like a hero." Roman holds absolute stillness, a cold tactician. "Do not mistake restraint for vanity." He modulates his tone. "I care because I know what happens to women Victor targets. And he is using a debt tied to my bloodline." Her body recoils, a visceral startle response. "Your family?" It proves a profound diagnostic truth. Suppressed generational histories inevitably hemorrhage into the present. "Your father's debt may have originated with mine," Roman reveals. "My father never said that," she cries, straining under cognitive dissonance. "Would he have?" Roman probes softly. The inquiry acts as a cognitive scalpel, instantly excising the fragile illusions she constructed around her father's manic final years. Gabriel spent his terminal years burying bills and making paranoid phone calls, leaving her to the predators. Resentment became her primary psychological fuel. Now, Roman restructures her reality. "Why would your father lend money to mine?" she asks. "That is what I am trying to find out," he replies smoothly. "And if you do find out," she whispers. Roman's eyes darken with lethal certainty. "Then I decide who pays for what happened to you." Rational preservation dictates she must flee this man tied to her ruin. Instead, she yields. This proves a tragic pathology. A wounded mind will willingly step into a dangerous fire to avoid freezing in absolute isolation. She grants him entry. As Roman crosses the threshold, his dominant presence permanently alters the room's fragile homeostasis. Track his visual sweep of the bedroom. He catalogues the inadequate robe, the chaotic stacks of cash, the autonomic way her body leans toward the exit. Sit, he commands softly. Her amygdala screams to flee, but severe exhaustion forces compliance. You and I must observe the terrifying elegance of his manipulation. Instead of using vertical intimidation, Roman crouches, minimizing his profile to bypass her defensive perimeter. Start from the beginning, he murmurs. No protecting your father. Tell me exactly how this started. Anchored by his stillness, her dissociative barriers undergo total collapse. True stabilization begins only when a subject stops simulating invulnerability. Bypassing logic, she speaks, using the sterile math of medical debt as a cognitive bridge into the dark void of her trauma. Her descent began where many case files do, the severe illness of a loved one. Financial ruin destroyed her safety net, exposing her to predators. Enforcers used affable personas initially, framing the extortion as a simple debt. When she missed their impossible deadlines, the sociopathic masks dissolved. They breached her home, proving they watched her mother's clinic. It was a calculated psychological siege. This exposes a brutal reality. The highest price we ever pay is the cost of our own survival. Roman processes her confession in predatory silence. His features lock into frozen hostility as she recites the grooming dialogue Vincent deployed. Just dancing, quick money, private clients if you choose. It is the precise linguistic programming malignant narcissists use to traffic human souls. In the heavy light, a muscle spasm in Roman's jaw is the sole indicator of his suppressed rage. He starts to speak but stops, sparing her the brutal inquiry. She elevates her chin in fragile defiance. No, she whispers. Vincent said you were available, Roman murmurs. She breaks eye contact. Vincent says whatever makes men open their wallets, you believe. Roman nods. At first, a flush of shame colors her cheeks. Of course you did. Roman lowers his tone. But I stopped believing him before you stepped off that stage. She stares, her breathing halted. Why? He delivers the truth. Because you look like someone trying not to break apart. You and I must recognize the power of this moment. Genuine empathy effortlessly penetrates our most fortified armor. That is the exact millisecond her internal reality shatters. Observe her carefully. What flashes in her eyes is not trust, but something more dangerous. Relief. Her cognitive walls fracture. Roman retreats, unable to process her raw grief. There is something else, she breathes. Trembling fingers extract a tarnished silver pendant. My father gave me this when I was 16, a week before he vanished. Roman's focus narrows, reverting to the analytical predator. What is it? I do not know, she whispers. He begged me never to lose it. If anyone asked about his debts, I must never mention this. Roman recognizes the signature of buried crimes. This proves a clinical truth. The dark secrets our parents conceal forge the psychological chains their children must wear. Did they come asking, he probes? Serafina lowers her head, hiding tears. A man came. Right after, he disappeared. Let us examine the behavioral dynamics here. Serafina describes a stranger at her door whose face went pale the moment he saw her necklace. Roman steps into her personal space but pauses, showing atypical restraint for a violent offender. May I? He asks. She hands the metal to his scarred fingers. This opens, he notes. She denies it, but he locates the hidden seam. This is not jewelry. It is a vessel, he diagnoses clinically. Her respiratory rate spikes. For what? She asks. Roman holds steady eye contact. Theorizing this explains why a megalomaniacal narcissist like Victor relentlessly bleeds her dry. It presents a stark psychological reality. The very objects we cling to for emotional comfort often harbor the blueprints of our own destruction. She finally processes the paralyzing truth. She wears a literal death warrant around her throat. Picture this with me. The idealized framework Serafina built around her father instantly shatters. She whispers into the heavy room, desperate to know if he truly concealed a secret inside the artifact. Roman observes her through the cold lens of a man conditioned by severe trauma. He states a basic rule of pathology. Predators do not stalk a vulnerable woman over $25,000 unless she possesses a massive hidden asset. His phone vibrating shatters the tension. Dominic reports 2 hostiles, disguised as medical staff, attempted an abduction at her mother's clinic. Serafina suppresses a traumatic tremor, her nervous system overloading. Roman's effect flattens as he asks if the attackers left a message. Sudden chaos strips away our cognitive dissonance, proving that the terrifying realities we try to repress will always eventually hunt us down. Dominic hesitates before delivering the psychological blow. He reports the bleeding hostile confessed the debt was never financial. It was entirely about the specific artifact her father stole. Acute panic floods Serafina's nervous system. She desperately denies the accusation, clinging to her fragile reality, insisting her father lacked that criminal capacity. Roman corrects her cognitive distortion with a detached yet mournful gaze. He points out that whatever was taken, the hunting party clearly has not retrieved it. Exhaling a slow breath, he forces her to confront the fact that she never knew the man her father devolved into at the end. It is a severe emotional hurdle we all must face. We project idealized versions onto the people we love, but true psychological maturity demands we accept them for the highly flawed humans they actually were. Roman's clinical assessment pierces her mental defenses. She projects absolute hostility, her hands shaking as she demands he leave the room. Roman exhibits a micro-expression of genuine surprise, unaccustomed to such direct rejection. Her voice cracks under the intense emotional load, accusing him of infecting her father's memory with his own violent pathology. Tears spill down her face. Roman flatlines into perfect stillness. For a fraction of a second, the ruthless exterior dissolves, exposing a man burdened by immense remorse. He places the artifact on the table with calculated care, softly instructing her to secure the door. She collapses onto the floor, entering a state of total emotional dysregulation. Total psychological collapse is often a necessary reset. We must break apart completely before we can process our trauma and reconstruct a functional, honest life. The extortion debt and Roman's omnipresence create a classic trauma bond environment. Serafina recognizes the systemic failure. She is trapped in a multi-generational cycle of inherited violence. Her primary protector is biologically linked to the very predators who dismantled her family. Downstairs, Roman's kinetic pacing mirrors an apex predator agitated by a severe threat, culminating in him slamming a ledger onto the desk. He consults Julian, a fellow behavioral specialist utterly devoid of ethical constraints. Julian methodically dissects Gabriel Marrow's history, treating the deceased courier as patient zero in a 15-year pathology. It demonstrates a stubborn clinical fact. Suppressed histories do not evaporate over time. Eventually, every unresolved trauma resurfaces to demand a severe psychological and physical reckoning. Under the harsh lighting, Julian conducts a clinical post-mortem on Gabriel's timeline. The files show massive infusions of illicit currency, followed by severe avoidant behaviors, the textbook panic response of a subject radicalized by medical debt. Roman's motor functions halt entirely when Julian reveals Gabriel acted as a logistical asset for Roman's father. Julian presents visual evidence. A grainy photograph displays their fathers interacting, with a third peripheral figure exhibiting clear indicators of dark triad traits. The hostile intent of this third subject is palpable in 2 dimensions. It marks the precise moment the psychological pathogen infected both bloodlines. We observe this pattern constantly. The unprocessed trauma and impulsive survival tactics of the parents inevitably mutate into the lethal burdens carried by their children. Stick with me here, let us analyze this behavioral shift. As the image sharpens, the threat profile escalates. The third man is Victor Cade. He is not an opportunistic scavenger. He is the megalomaniacal architect of this crisis. Julian hypothesizes that Gabriel expropriated a sensitive asset from Victor. Roman looks upward, mentally tracking the room where Serafina is processing her trauma. A subordinate recommends immediate physical extraction of the artifact. Roman snaps a harsh refusal. He insists she must integrate the truth voluntarily, not through coercion. His operatives misinterpret this as cold manipulation. But, clinically speaking, the antisocial exterior is fracturing. The kingpin is forming an emotional attachment. True authority does not demand submission. It creates the psychological safety needed for a subject to willingly drop their defenses. In the isolated upper chamber, the silence is broken by Serafina's hyperventilation. She fixates on the metallic object, experiencing severe cognitive dissonance regarding her father's true moral alignment. I can assure you, the psychological friction of ambiguity degrades a subject's mental state far faster than blunt facts. She engages in a verbal coping mechanism, whispering a prayer. When the door opens, Roman alters his physical gait. He abandons the dominant posture of an apex predator, approaching with slow non-aggression and offering a warm beverage. It is a profound deviation from his established baseline. He is systematically de-escalating her amygdala response, substituting hostility with unexpected emotional comfort. It demonstrates how introducing a single prosocial variable can completely recalibrate a human being's survival algorithms. Her eyes track him erratically, evaluating the gesture as a potential trap. She questions the incongruity of a violent offender displaying nurturing behaviors. Roman examines his scarred hands, verbally acknowledging his lack of psychological insight. We are observing two damaged subjects, attempting mutual emotional regulation. This radical transparency bypasses her threat detection systems faster than any manipulation. He transfers the dossier to her, shifting their dynamic from captor and captive to equal collaborators. By instructing her to remain skeptical of the data, he paradoxically establishes himself as her only reliable anchor. The documents reveal the clinical deterioration of her father's psyche, ending with an image of a rusted storage unit. It proves a core behavioral principle. Unfiltered mutual vulnerability is the absolute only way to establish genuine trust in a deeply deceptive environment. We observe a sudden breakthrough in Serafina's dissociative amnesia. An episodic memory surfaces. A malfunctioning vending machine beneath the harsh lights of an industrial lot. The memory centers on her father, exhibiting severe physiological distress. He grips her shoulders, transferring the burden of a lethal secret. This is a profound form of developmental abuse. When parental figures weaponize a child's cognitive load with adult trauma, they guarantee lifelong psychological fracturing. The repressed data finally articulates, and she vocalizes an alphanumeric sequence. B17. In the adjoining surveillance hub, Roman and Julian exhibit a total cessation of movement. The microphone transmits the audio. In a single breath, a severe symptom of childhood PTSD has instantly converted into the precise operational intelligence required to survive the impending cartel war. The situational urgency peaks as Roman evaluates their deteriorating timeline. If Victor is aware of the container, his assets are already converging on the sector. Serafina experiences mild physical tremors in her damp clothing. Despite her vulnerability under the stark lighting, Roman maintains a rigidly clinical visual discipline. He hands her low-visibility tactical garments, utilizing dark humor to manage his own stress by critiquing his partner's catastrophic thinking. The physiological response that follows is unexpected. Serafina laughs. It is a fragmented stress reaction, yet it signifies a massive cognitive pivot. She has transitioned out of the passive victim pathology. This illustrates a critical survival mechanism. Generating a humor response during peak trauma is frequently the neurological catalyst required to reassert executive control and survive the chaos. You and I have both seen how a minor behavioral anomaly can recalibrate an environment. When that genuine laugh breaks her tension, the psychological atmosphere shifts. Roman operates on a strict sociopathic framework, categorizing emotional bonds as a terminal liability. Strategically, he should have forcefully dismantled the pendant for its data. Instead, he delays, showing a pathological need for her voluntary compliance. This exposes a severe vulnerability in human neurobiology. The millisecond we prioritize another subject's emotional integrity over our own survival protocols, we expose our vital arteries to the blade. When Serafina steps from the shadows, stripped of her defensive posturing, she is acutely genuine. For one cardiac cycle, the conditioned assassin simply stares, dissociating from his violent objectives. Empathy will neutralize even the most lethal psychological programming. Observe Serafina beneath that dim hallway bulb. Catching Roman's stare, she crosses her arms, a textbook barrier driven by survival instinct. Roman's nervous system betrays him. He clears his throat, fighting a rapid pulse with a clumsy remark. You and I are watching the line blur between captor and savior, the early stages of a trauma bond. As they reach the stairs, this cognitive distortion shatters. Below them sits a predatory reality of men loading weapons. A rival plots their slaughter, while a sociopath hides within Roman's walls. They are rushing toward a total psychological fracture. The clinical takeaway here is absolute. No matter how deeply we try to hide, inside the illusion of a safe moment, the violent realities of the world will always break down the door. The camera pushes in on the suffocating darkness. Roman and Serafina move deeper into this fatal labyrinth, unaware that the line between a ruthless guardian and captive has completely dissolved. It forces us to look at a terrifying reality. True warmth cannot breathe when it is buried under the absolute need to control. Soon, she will see the violence he unleashes when his property is threatened. Yet, paralyzed by their shared tragedy, they miss the executioner hiding in the shadows. A solitary traitor wipes cold sweat from his jaw, his face bathed in the harsh light of a phone. He sends a silent transmission, summoning hell to these rusted gates. The message flies to a phantom enemy, a rival whose name would push Roman to slaughter without a single second of hesitation. Miles away, a shadow waits in the black. A lifeless smile creeps across his face as his fingers slide heavy ammunition into a sniper rifle. The frame cuts sharply back to Roman and Serafina stepping into the desolate storage yard. The freezing wind transforms a simple search into a living nightmare. You and I have probably felt this specific kind of silence before. It is that heavy stillness that always arrives right before a permanent tragedy. Rusted metal doors line the path like forgotten tombs. Roman scatters his enforcers to hunt the perimeter, his dark eye piercing the gloom. Beside him, Serafina trembles violently, her knuckles bleach bone white around her father's pendant. It leaves us with a painful truth. We can never outpace the invisible demons we refuse to confront. The sharp stench of decaying rust overwhelms Serafina. In a flash of memory, she is dragged into her childhood. She feels the phantom weight of her father pressing her into the dark, pleading with her to hide. The innocent confusion morphs into paralyzing panic. Roman stands still, observing the quiver of her jaw. He moves close enough to anchor her spiraling thoughts, his presence acting as a dark gravity. "Do you recognize anything?" he asks, his voice a low rumble. Fighting through the mental fog, she faintly recalls a broken vending machine and a burnt-out bulb. Roman signals his crew to tap the cameras, pinning her with a relentless stare. "Think," he commands. It is a vital warning for us all. The most gentle words are very often the invisible chains of absolute dominance. Roman pushes her deeper into the memory. Serafina shuts her eyes, regressing to a terrified little girl. The echo of her father's forced laughter fills her ears, a sound designed to mask his paralyzing fear. She visualizes his shaking fingers, tracing a cryptic code onto her palm. "Unit B-71, she declares with sudden clarity. That was her ultimate lifeline. Roman orders his enforcers to sweep the metal maze. They vanish into the suffocating gloom. Serafina is unraveling, her heartbeat pulsing against her pale skin. Still, Roman remains rooted beside her, an imposing fortress of dark calm. It is a tragic display of a trauma bond forming. In our vulnerable moments of panic, we willingly chain our survival to the monsters who could easily drown us. You and I should look closely at the tragedy of this exact moment. As Roman guides her, Serafina's terror rots into a desperate trust. They arrive at Unit B-71. A corroded padlock secures the door like a sealed crypt of grief. Roman lifts iron cutters, but Serafina halts him. Her hands shake as she unclasps her pendant, recalling how her father would obsessively tap it when his world fell apart. Roman accepts the necklace, analyzing it with the focus of an assassin. He turns it over, revealing a microscopic carving of the storage number. Serafina drops to the frozen concrete, crushed by the revelation. "It is a key," Roman murmurs into the black air. It captures a brutal human reality. Our agonizing burdens are almost always camouflaged as precious gifts of love. Roman shatters the lock. The snap pierces the silence. He forces the door upward, exhaling damp decay and buried sins. A dying bulb flickers, to expose the pathetic truth of her father's existence. There is no wealth, just a dented cabinet, a decaying fireproof box, and rotting cardboard. Serafina steps across the threshold, walking into the deception that poisoned her childhood. Roman glides behind her, a dark shadow. Dominic barks a warning from the doorway, but she hears nothing. Her eyes are glued to that box. She stands frozen, fighting a losing war to merge the father she worshipped with the stranger he actually was. We all must swallow this jagged pill. The heartbreak of growing up is discovering our childhood idols were always just terrified, broken people. Julian steps out of the gloom, his flashlight slicing through the thick dust. Roman remains perfectly still in the shadows, commanding them to open the safe first. Watch how violently Serafina's pale hands shake as she hesitates, her fingers strangling the silver pendant. It highlights a tragic human reflex. We instinctively cling to the familiar pain we know, terrified of the unknown truth. Julian locates a concealed ridge along the steel. A sharp snap echoes off the damp concrete walls. Lying inside on rotted red velvet is a tiny brass key. For her entire life, she carried the architect of her trauma against her own beating heart. It proves a profound lesson. The emotional weights we refuse to put down are frequently the exact instruments required for our true freedom. Roman's stoic face breaks with a brief, melancholy smile. Julian twists the brass, and the steel surrenders with a heavy clack. Under the flickering light sit two artifacts of ruin, a silver flash drive and yellowing papers bound by a decaying ribbon. Julian reaches for the documents. The color drains from his face, turning him into a ghost. Roman drags the ledger across the rusted desk, his dark eyes scanning the faded ink. Gabriel Marrow's signature rests right next to Roman's own brutal father. But the third name makes the muscles in Roman's jaw bulge with restrained fury. Luca Santoro, the brother he trusted more than God himself. Dominic exhales a devastated curse. Serafina's voice fractures as she begs to know who Luca is. Roman refuses to sugarcoat the horror creeping into the room. The most fatal wounds are never inflicted by nameless enemies in the dark. The monsters that tear your life apart are always the smiling friends you welcome to eat at your own table. Julian grabs the next page, hands trembling. Julian's voice barely manages to break the silence. This worn book is not merely an accounting of stolen cash. It is a fully loaded weapon. Gabriel was coerced into burying their venomous sins. A sharp gasp rips from Serafina's throat. She stares at Roman, whose knuckles have gone white, gripping the frosted desk. He is paralyzed by a handwritten memo from his own father. The faded ink coldly dictates that Gabriel was terrified, and his silence needed to be permanently secured. Roman reads the betrayal 3 times. Serafina stares at the paper, watching her innocent universe vaporize into dust. "Was he just a thief?" she asks. Julian shakes his head slowly. Gabriel was not stealing. He was forging a desperate shield to keep his daughter alive. It teaches us a haunting lesson. What the world comfortably labels as cowardice is often just a terrified parent crossing every moral line to ensure their child sees tomorrow. The devastating reality violently clicks into place. Gabriel signed his own execution warrant the second he hoarded these documents. A warm tear escapes Serafina's eye. Her father was never a coward. He was a silent fortress, absorbing the deadly crossfire to protect his little girl. She reaches out to claim the St. Silver drive, but Julian sharply snaps that they are exposed. Roman slides the cold metal slip into his coat, and then the heavy quiet shatters. A deafening rifle round tears through the night, punching a jagged hole through the steel door an inch from Serafina's face. She drops to the concrete. Roman moves with the terrifying fluidity of a shadow. His massive arm hooks her waist, dragging her behind the rusted cabinet while Dominic fires blindly into the dark. The yard detonates into a hellscape of exploding glass and shrieking metal. It forces us to accept a cruel reality. The serene peace we desperately cling to is often nothing more than an illusion. It is just a held breath before the true nightmare begins. The roar of heavy engines erupts outside. Dominic screams over the deafening gunfire. They walked blindly into an orchestrated slaughter. Roman's dark eyes narrow, processing the betrayal. Someone inside his own circle sold him to the highest bidder. Serafina presses her spine against the concrete, convulsing with terror. Roman hovers over her, using his broad back to block the jagged shrapnel slicing through the air. Her fingers bury themselves in her necklace as her childhood illusions burn to ash. Strip away the tailored suits, and this is all that remains. Just primal violence. The harshest reality of human nature is undeniable. The elegant masks we wear always melt away the second our survival is challenged. While mercenaries flood the perimeter, Roman operates with a disturbing calm. He flashes a hand signal through the smoke. Without hesitation, Dominic drops an advancing assassin with one thunderous shot. Let us examine this clinical file together, you and I, and observe how trauma bonds form under fire. A lifeless body strikes the earth. Julian takes cover behind a van, securing the ledger. Muzzle flashes illuminate Roman's jaw as he commands Serafina to flee toward Dominic. Her refusal is fascinating. She latches onto his sleeve. He snaps that this is no negotiation, yet Serafina weaponizes her hysteria, screaming to stop being treated as an object. A validating pride thaws Roman's cold exterior. He dictates she should be afraid. She confesses her terror. Then use it, he instructs. Psychologically, fear is either a paralytic or a catalyst. Roman eliminates 2 targets with surgical precision and roars for her to run. Her boots slip on the wet gravel as she obeys. Dominic intercepts her trembling frame behind a decaying truck, pressing the cold steel of a firearm into her unresponsive hands. In the mud, her former psychological baseline fractures entirely. Analytically speaking, survival instinct only activates when the delusion of rescue is abandoned. She presses against a tire. Pupils dilated, fixated entirely on Roman. Staccato bursts of orange gunfire illuminate his movements. He exhibits no pathological rage. Instead, he operates with the chilling calculation of an apex predator, firing with exact geometry to establish a perimeter around her. A healthy mind would recoil from this carnage, but Serafina exhibits early indicators of Stockholm Syndrome. The extreme violence does not repulse her. It magnetizes her, establishing a toxic dependency rooted in the adrenaline of a lethal environment. As the auditory trauma of gunfire recedes into a hollow acoustic echo, a solitary combatant attempts to flee. Julian halts Roman's pursuit, thrusting a vibrating mobile device toward him. Roman seizes it. Through the speaker slithers the sociopathic cadence of Luca Santoro, entirely detached from the visceral reality of the slaughter. Here we observe the classic megalomaniac narcissist. Luca mocks Roman's residual empathy. In criminal syndicates, compassion is clinically diagnosed as a fatal vulnerability. Notice Roman's physiological response. His fist clenches until the knuckles whiten, suppressed rage spiking his cortisol levels. Yet Luca merely laughs. To a malignant narcissist like Luca, dismantling an entire family structure registers as nothing more than an administrative task, utterly devoid of moral weight. Luca outlines the architecture of his psychological dominance. He explains that debts are engineered never to close, functioning purely as instruments of perpetual subjugation. Serafina collapses, displaying the hollow stare of acute traumatic shock. Roman suppresses his hostility behind a stone-faced exterior, demanding Luciana's location with a controlled vocal register. On the transmission, Luca inhales audibly, exhibiting the theatricality typical of a megalomaniac narcissist. He exploited a fundamental cognitive bias, humanity's unquestioning obedience to authority. A guttural scream ruptures from Serafina. The physical assault was merely a diversionary tactic. Luca's operatives bypassed hospital security effortlessly. We see that the most lethal vector of attack is always a victim's own misplaced trust. Stick with me, because the behavioral dynamic fundamentally shifts here. Luciana's abduction plunges Serafina into severe hyperventilation. Roman lowers the device, his facial muscles going entirely slack. This detachment is a dissociation technique utilized by veteran predators. "You told me she was safe," she whispers. He steps forward, issuing a vow of retrieval. "You cannot promise that," she screams, her cognitive dam breaking. He remains rigid, clinically absorbing her emotional projection. "Listen to me," he commands, his low voice grounding her spiraling frequency. Luca made a mistake. Her tremors stall as curiosity overrides panic. Roman closes the physical distance, eclipsing her in his shadow. A narcissist is always most vulnerable, the second they believe they have achieved absolute victory. He made this personal, Roman states, slicing through her acute anxiety. "What does that mean?" she asks. Roman maintains unblinking, sustained eye contact. "It means I am done talking." His vocal amplitude remains perfectly level. In behavioral analysis, an absence of vocal escalation during high-stress scenarios is the primary indicator of lethal intent. Quiet pathology is infinitely more destructive than explosive rage. Dominic identifies a geographic target near the river. "We strike first," Roman mandates, seizing the psychological initiative. Julian displays the encrypted flash drive. Roman redirects the unit to his fortified estate to establish a secure perimeter. 60 minutes later, under the clinical blue radiation of his monitors, their forensics expose an institutional sociopathy far more malignant than their initial threat assessment ever indicated. You and I will examine this digital evidence together. The pale screen casts harsh shadows, decoding a network of organized psychopathy. Directories document decades of systemic corruption. At the apex sits Luca Santoro, his posture radiating the grandiosity of a megalomaniac narcissist. Surveillance shows Victor Cade trafficking human subjects with complete emotional detachment. Roman anchors himself against the desk, jaw muscles flexing. The betrayer had operated inside his own inner circle. Proximity always provides the optimal angle for a fatal strike. Serafina's physical response shifts from weeping to the frozen paralysis of horror. "My father saw this?" she asks. Julian provides a terse nod. Dominic executes a grainy video file. Gabriel's deteriorating face dominates the screen, exhibiting severe hypervigilance as he scans for his inevitable assassins. Confronted with her father's image, Serafina suffers an acute autonomic shock. This recording serves as a posthumous psychological profile. Gabriel dictates his confession to the lens. He identified the syndicate's operational matrix and attempted an extortion strategy to secure his family. His primary cognitive error was projecting human reasoning onto clinical psychopaths. When negotiating with individuals devoid of empathy, the victim never controls the transaction. Serafina's mental barriers collapse. The internalized narrative of paternal abandonment dissolves in milliseconds. Beside her, Roman adopts a rigid posture to mask his internal processing. Gabriel's testament diagnoses Luca as fundamentally devoid of conscience. He identifies Roman as the sole instrument capable of excising the diseased tissue before Victor's rabid pathology consumes them all. The monitor terminates into aggressive static, projecting a harsh strobe across the room. In criminal psychology, closure is a myth. There is only the processing of raw trauma. Serafina sinks into a seat as decades of repressed abandonment issues dismantle her ego defenses. Observe Roman's micro-reactions. His retinas reflect the chaotic white noise. He did not execute Gabriel, yet the systemic guilt of his syndicate acts as a crushing psychological weight. He recognizes the pathological infection Luca introduced. "He knew my name," Roman murmurs, his tone entirely devoid of its usual dominant resonance. Dominic processes this silently, deducing that Gabriel weaponized Roman's reputation as a violent corrective measure. Generational sins are inescapable and require direct confrontation. Roman slowly pivots, locking his absolute focus onto the psychologically shattered woman. Roman bridges the spatial gap, navigating a room saturated with acute depressive affect. He applies firm tactile pressure to her shoulders, manipulating her posture to enforce eye contact. With clinical exactitude, he restructures her cognitive distortion. He isolates the core fact: her father fabricated his abandonment as a protective psychological barrier. It is a frequent paradox that our most severe emotional lacerations are inflicted by protective guardians. When she questions the persistent sting of the deception, Roman provides an unfiltered truth. The neurological pathways for profound attachment and catastrophic grief are identical. Her remaining defense mechanisms disintegrate. She slumps against his torso, and he secures her within a possessive physical hold. For a brief interval, the external threat matrix is suspended, prioritizing their mutual psychological trauma. The acoustic environment narrows to her hyperventilation against his sternum. Analyze the sustained tension in Roman's jaw. We are observing an apex predator, conditioned in an environment devoid of emotional stimulus, experiencing a sudden influx of uncharacteristic empathy. The supporting operatives tactically withdraw to provide isolation. As she retracts with erratic breathing, Roman secures the base of her skull, a grounding technique to prevent further dissociation. She examines the facial micro-expressions of a documented killer, yet identifies only a protective surrogate. She inquires about her future disposition post-crisis. Roman bypasses analytical hesitation. "You stay with me," he dictates, vocalizing an absolute directive. Psychological sanctuary is rarely a geographical location. It is simply a dominant figure willing to share the subject's absolute isolation. Stick with me for this final observation. The operational focus isolates the two subjects. Roman issues a definitive condition. She must not ask that unless prepared for permanent enmeshment with his criminal lifestyle. Despite the threat matrix outside, her heart rate spikes from arousal, not fear. Her panic response is entirely overridden by Stockholm Syndrome's intoxicating magnetism. He applies minimal pressure to her mandible, testing her flight response. She remains completely stationary. The physical intimacy is a total collapse of her prior independent identity. Within his hold, a subject categorized her entire life as collateral damage finally reassigns her psychological value. We invariably accept the precise level of attachment our self-esteem permits. This synchronized rhythm is abruptly terminated by Dominic's vocal intrusion, instantly reinstating the hostile reality. Observe the micro-expressions in this precise frame. When Dominic whispers the location, Roman's empathy vanishes, replaced by the flat affect of a sociopathic predator. He shuts down his emotional processing, retreating into the cold sanctuary of violence. "Then we end it," he commands. His instinct is classic pathological overprotection. Yet, look at Serafina's response. She correctly diagnoses Luca's fractured psyche. Understanding her presence is the stimulus needed to force his hand. We must remember that true psychological resilience is never avoiding the things that broke us, but facing them with new coping mechanisms. Dominic clinically calculates her logic and agrees, earning a look of absolute homicidal ideation from Roman. Julian aligns with her, acting as an enabler to her extreme exposure therapy. Roman's facial muscles betray massive cognitive dissonance. His logical brain accepts her tactical value, but his amygdala screams in sheer panic. Serafina has successfully mutated from passive victim to the apex architect of her survival. We then transition to the warehouse. Notice Victor pacing the concrete. He exhibits the classic agitation of a megalomaniac narcissist craving violent validation. Conversely, Luca remains entirely motionless. He is the pathological conductor of this orchestrated disaster, displaying zero somatic markers of guilt. It proves a dark reality. The most dangerous individuals are rarely the ones screaming, but the ones sitting in absolute, calculated silence. Let us examine this clinical file together and analyze their massive cognitive error. Victor and Luca operate on the sociopathic assumption that emotional attachment creates a fatal handicap. They fail to understand that Roman has already rationalized the complete annihilation of his moral compass to keep her alive. Narcissistic personality consistently underestimate the lethality of a subject who abandons self-preservation. Outside, the strike is methodical. Guards are neutralized with terrifying efficiency. Roman isolates Serafina inside the armored vehicle, pressing his forehead to hers. It is a primal transference of security. We learn here that authentic devotion requires stripping away our own psychological armor so the people we value can wear it safely. The environment fractures into a high-decibel trauma zone. The structure becomes an enclosed arena of extreme kinetic violence. Observe Victor's subordinates. Their grandiose self-image shatters instantly against an aggressor who processes violence without emotional friction. Yet, the true psychological weight of this event is isolated within the armored car. Serafina is trapped in an echo chamber of acoustic trauma. She grips the firearm until her bones strain against the skin. This isolation highlights a fundamental human condition. The most severe psychological battles are never fought in the open, but within the claustrophobic borders of our own escalating panic. Suddenly, a biological threat interrupts her internal crisis as a bleeding hostile violently strikes the reinforced glass. Acute stress response floods her nervous system, attempting to initiate a freeze state. The neurological scarring of her past demands, she regress into compliance. But a cognitive override occurs. She retrieves an auditory memory of Roman's grounding instructions to anchor her brain. She actively rejects the pathological role of the victim. The weapon discharges, creating a massive sensory overload as the glass disintegrates. The external threat is permanently neutralized. She has effectively rewired her own neural pathways, proving that authentic bravery is not a lack of autonomic fear, but the cognitive decision to act against it. She forcefully clears a tear, locking away the emotion. Inside the facility, Victor exhibits extreme cowardice, using her mother as a human shield. Step inside this clinical observation space with me. Luca enters the visual field, exhibiting the classic, theatrical grandiosity of severe Stockholm Syndrome. He has spent decades servicing an organization that systematically dismantled his identity. Yet pathology reveres his abusers. It is a chilling psychological warning for all of us. When we refuse to process our deep-seated resentments, we essentially construct and lock our own mental prisons. Luca projects his internal toxicity outward, weaponizing historical data about Roman's father. Roman responds with complete emotional detachment, keeping his focus locked on the threat. But then, the heavy door opens. Serafina walks in, introducing a totally unpredictable variable into this violently unstable psychological equation. Here we document the first failure in Roman's dissociative barrier. His jaw involuntarily contracts. The psychological burden of attachment has breached his defenses. Luca identifies this micro-expression and verbally attacks her trauma. Beside him, Victor escalates physical pressure on the captive. Observe Serafina's physical state. Her hands present visible tremors due to severe adrenaline saturation, yet her voice remains completely sound. Authentic resilience requires us to hold our ground even as our body prepares for total collapse. The silence stretches until it violently ruptures. Operating on raw maternal protective instinct, Luciana launches her compromised physique at the narcissist. Roman's motor reflexes engage instantly, dropping Victor to the concrete with one clinical strike. The visual field degrades into sensory deprivation, punctuated by the violent strobing of muzzle flashes. The dying narcissist, experiencing a catastrophic ego collapse, attempts a final exertion of control. This exact data point is critical. It marks the permanent neurological death of the traumatized victim and the birth of an apex survivor. Serafina inserts herself between the aggressor and her mother. The subject who previously exhibited paralyzing fear now stabilizes a lethal weapon. She verbally confirms their miscalculation of her emotional capacity before firing. It is a harsh reality that our deepest psychological wounds often synthesize our most devastating coping mechanisms. As the heavy body impacts the floor, Roman rotates sharply, intercepting Luca's concealed blade. You and I have analyzed this specific manifestation of pathological arrogance before. It is the terminal cognitive bias in these criminal profiles. The kinetic struggle leaves Roman in a temporary state of imbalance, which Luca misinterprets as a definitive victory. The veteran criminal entirely fails to assess his periphery. The termination event does not originate from the alpha antagonist. Observe Luciana. Her hands grip the discarded firearm with mechanical certainty. Decades of chronic domestic abuse and suppressed trauma have compressed into singular, lethal intent. She establishes direct eye contact with her tormentor, reclaiming her autonomy, and fires. We learn here that the subjects these megalomaniacs marginalize inevitably become the instruments of their final destruction. The heavy dust settles, establishing a stark visual contrast. Victor's biological systems fail as he props his ruined anatomy against the debris. Roman navigates the damage, his facial muscles presenting the textbook mask of a sociopath de-escalating from violence. He discards the weapon, creating an auditory void. Actively repressing pain signals from his own hemorrhage, Roman kneels beside Serafina. In his fractured cognitive map, she is the sole stabilizing variable. Experiencing acute shock, her focus locks onto his physical trauma. Her terror transmutes into severe anxiety for his survival. Authentic human attachment fundamentally requires the temporary suppression of our own subjective suffering to stabilize the psychological bleeding of our partner. Roman mechanically deflects her tactile assessment. His vocalization is a calculated intervention designed to ground her dissociating psyche. He initiates gentle facial contact, displaying the severe contradiction of a subject programmed for lethality, exhibiting high-level empathy. Luciana processes this data from the floor. She verbally labels this apex predator as a divine savior. We witness a micro-expression of intense distress around Roman's eyes. A mind that has internalized its identity as a malignant force cannot process positive reinforcement. It is a profound clinical truth that our fundamental value is frequently imperceptible to our own traumatized egos. The immediate hemorrhage is contained, but the anticipation of systemic warfare triggers an acute state of hypervigilance. Today, you and I will unpack this case file together, stepping away from the blood and into the pathology of a king at war. We are observing a clinical montage of systemic erasure. With the cold detachment of a surgeon, Roman severs the arteries of his rival's empire. Men who believed they were gods are erased. He is violently cutting away the rotting flesh of his own toxic legacy. This behavior teaches us a hard truth. Sometimes you must burn down your house to be free of its ghosts. The real psychiatric anomaly is his return to her. Pushing open the heavy oak door, the violence drains out of his rigid posture. Serafina stands by the window in the dawn light. The world outside is burning, yet in her silhouette, this megalomaniac narcissist finds his only peace. The second the door clicks shut, her hyper-vigilant eyes dart to his bandaged ribs. The night's acute trauma hums beneath her pale skin like a live wire. She turns to him, her voice a ragged breath. She took a human life, and the guilt is fracturing her psyche. Roman steps into the light, his tone steady. He reframes the act not as murder, but as the necessary price of breathing in his world. The clinical pathology deepens as she whispers that her tremors only stop when he is in the room. It is a devastating surrender, deeply rooted in Stockholm Syndrome. We learn that often, the greatest peace we find is hidden inside the chaos we fear most. This untouchable predator, a man of iron and blood, is suddenly brought to his knees by the staggering weight of her raw honesty. Roman's jaw tightens into a hard line of repressed guilt and fear. He attempts to push Serafina away, desperately trying to trigger a normal survival instinct in her mind. Grinding his words like crushed stone, he warns her to run from his heavy shadow. But her fingers only curl tighter into his shirt, defying all logical self-preservation. He knows he cannot erase the psychological bruises of her past. Instead, he issues a blood-sworn vow to stand as a wall of fire between her and the wolves. Observe the agonizing cognitive dissonance inside him. He whispers she is free to leave, yet his massive hands hold her desperately against his chest. This behavioral dynamic reminds us that love is often a terrifying gamble, demanding we risk our safety for another. Let us examine this clinical pivot together. You and I, Roman, frames his devotion as a brutal contract, offering to be the apex predator, keeping all other monsters at bay. Serafina studies him, haunted by a past where men used promises as manipulative chains. A fragile smile touches her lips as she admits she really ought to hate him. The suffocating tension snaps when Roman sighs, muttering about his awful luck with romance. That brief flash of humor fundamentally alters the psychological baseline of the room. The physiological terror visibly drains from her rigid shoulders. Her touch is no longer a desperate trauma response, but a conscious choice. This behavioral shift teaches us a profound truth. True personal agency only begins when our deepest fears finally end. His arms surround her with the possessive gravity of a megalomaniac narcissist. He holds his only anchor to reality tightly, even as his mind plots the burial of his enemies. When Serafina playfully leans back, a rare warmth softens the cruel angles of Roman's face. The hunted animal inside her nervous system finally rests, revealing profound physiological relief in her smile. Yet, The tragic irony remains thick in this clinical observation. The gentle peace inside the room is bought by the blood spilling outside. The corrupt Mafia empire crumbles under the crushing weight of Roman's antisocial fury. We learn a heavy psychological lesson here. True safety often demands a painfully steep price. The cowards who once hid behind Luca's throne now blindly flee into the dark. Stick with me here as we arrive at a pivotal psychiatric truth. True cognitive healing is never about hiding from the dark, but learning to see clearly within it. Roman tries to shield her, building an iron fortress to isolate her from trauma, but the fragile victim is gone. Over the seasons, Serafina refuses the suffocating safety of a glass cage. Instead of shrinking into avoidance, she stands tall in his study, systematically organizing the exact files that once triggered her absolute terror. She dismantles her own clinical nightmare, piece by piece, under a simple desk lamp. By stepping out of the ingrained shadow of victimhood, she teaches us a vital reality. Real psychological strength means adapting your mind to actively thrive, even inside a highly dangerous world. For the first time, Roman's absolute pathological control is fracturing. Serafina is no longer terrified of his presence, making her the most dangerous psychological variable in his rigid world. He tries to draw firm boundaries, but she steps effortlessly over them, overriding his notoriously cold logic. Months later, as his rival's empire burns to ash, we can close this bloody psychiatric chapter together. The camera catches them in a quiet courtyard, watching the red sun bleed below the horizon. They are entirely bound to one another now. Their trauma-bonded survival reveals a hard-earned clinical lesson. True mental healing rarely means returning to a baseline state of pure innocence. Instead, it is simply learning exactly how to walk through the total darkness without flinching. The violent aftermath of this war concludes without the histrionic theater usually observed in the antisocial underworld. A stable psychological peace settles in. Luciana breathes without severe paranoia. Roman exhibits a profound behavioral transformation, governing through disciplined order rather than narcissistic terror. Serafina carries the neurological scars of her trauma, but wears them as medals of post-traumatic resilience. When Roman approaches her, the usual alpha dominance is entirely eradicated from his physical posture. He offers her a simple, unpretentious ring, marking the breathtaking climax of our clinical evaluation. He has finally internalized a profound psychological lesson. A human heart only truly belongs to you when it is completely free to simply walk away. The air fractured as Roman took a sharp, deregulated breath. This vocalization defied the psychological conditioning of his bloodline. Past sociopathic patriarchs would diagnose this vulnerability as a fatal weakness. Yet, Roman deliberately drops N's emotional armor. He speaks of the poison surrounding them, his voice thick with newly formed empathy. He confesses that when their eyes first met, his empire of cruelty began to crumble. We rarely witness such a profound psychological ego death. A man conditioned to rule through terror voluntarily dismantles his own throne, offering her an equal baseline of peace. This teaches us a vital lesson. Tearing down our deepest psychological defensive walls is the bravest act of all. Serafina lets the silence linger, finally reclaiming her power. The clinical tension breaks when a genuine smile touches Serafina's lips. She accepts his surrender, establishing a firm behavioral boundary laced with dark humor. She promises that if his controlling narcissistic shadows ever return, she will simply vanish. Emotional warmth floods Roman's eyes, sealing their unspoken vow. In this psychiatric theater, she has completely rewired his brain. Tossed into a ruthless criminal ecosystem, she processed severe systemic trauma and walked out psychologically unbroken. Roman realizes the true existential threat was never a rival boss, but the terrifying prospect of living without her. This reminds us that our greatest resilience lies in finding hope. It takes undeniable bravery to trust a fragile connection born directly from the ruins of our minds. As our analytical lens pulls back, we reflect on this fascinating behavioral case study. Share this clinical profile with anyone who understands the fierce resilience of the human mind. You and I have walked through a twisted mental maze today, exploring the heavy cognitive toll of trauma and the psychological miracle of survival. The human psyche is an endless, shadowed hallway. If this intense psychiatric evaluation moved you, stay close as we open more dark pathological files. Our next session will pull us deeper into the terrifying depths of the criminal mind. Remember this profound psychological truth as we part ways today. We must never look away from the darkness. It is only by actively analyzing our deepest cognitive shadows that we truly learn how to safely protect the light.